it's a pretty grim outlook, and I don't think it's alarmist. I think that those tragedies are in play based on just how rapidly gambling is growing across the country.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Narrative Podcast. Mike Andrews and David Mahan joining you today. And David, I'm going to ask you, with the Super Bowl coming up this weekend, I know you're not a big sports guy, but are you a guy who watches the Super Bowl just for commercials, spectacles, that kind of thing?
Actually, I hate commercials. So that's why I don't watch sports.
Well, here's the thing I was thinking about. There was a time, and I think it's past, when the commercials were a big deal because now they're all on YouTube, like the week before the Super Bowl. You don't even have to watch them.
I will say that they are the best commercials of all the year that you're going to watch. You're going to see the best ones on Super Bowl.
If you're going to watch commercials, that's the time to do it.
That's right.
But we've actually got a great conversation today that's going to tie in with the Super Bowl a little bit because we're going to talk with Danny Funt. He's got a new book out about all the problems of sports gambling. And I don't want to give too much away because we still got to get through the news. But, you know, David, we've had some conversations here on the podcast where I think you just have to listen to it to really understand the gravity of the situation, thinking to the interview we did with Jared Horvath a couple weeks ago, or even going back to the Emma Waters conversation on IVF. Like, this felt like one of those conversations that people really need to listen to and share to understand the issue.
You know, so many times the issues that we address here at CCV, most people pretty much have it, you know, a sense of what's going on. This gambling area was completely new to me, right? And I'm working in schools and things like that years ago. We know folks that have had gambling problems, but until you start going and doing deep dives like we're doing with Funt and others that we've interviewed, you just have no idea how big a problem this is.
Yeah, and what I appreciated so much about Danny and the book that he's written is he's a true journalist first.
Yeah.
This is just good old-fashioned journalism of I'm going to go to sources, I'm going to investigate the problem, and I'm going to report on it, and found some pretty hard evidence to talk about, but a necessary conversation. That'll be coming up here in just a few minutes after we get through some key news items. And one of the main news items that we just missed last week when we recorded the podcast was that there was news that came down that for the first time ever, a detransitioner won a lawsuit, a malpractice lawsuit against the surgeon who removed her breasts at age 15, I believe, in New York, won a $2 million settlement. And I don't think we can understate the importance of that case and what it means for the whole gender ideology and pediatric gender surgery business that we've been hammering on for years here at CCB.
Yeah. You know, this is you've heard the stories of Chloe Cole and different ones who, were medicalized early on, double mastectomies, other issues that they've had. I think for years we've just been trying to get awareness, to where people will really know that this is a thing and what it looks like. And, it's not just about feelings, it's about physical harm, right? I think the next step in this tipping point that we're experiencing of people's attitudes changing in this area, people being, kind of encouraged to speak up in this area. The next phase are these medical malpractice suits. And it looks like we've got about, started with a couple of them, and then we held it about a dozen, but now we're about 24, 25 of these lawsuits. And this one is the first to drop. And yeah, it's Fox Varian. She's 22 years old now, but when she was younger, as a teen, she was medicalized in New York with a double mastectomy. And we're all glad to see that she was able to get that $2 million, but it was $1.6 million for past and future suffering and $400,000 for future medical expenses. That is huge. That is a huge precedent. First of all, because in a lot of states, there's damage caps. Like here in Ohio, we've got a $250,000 damage cap. And so, when you think of what it will cost an individual, a detransitioner, if there is such a thing, right? Somebody who's been medicalized, it's going to cost them socially to detransition. And so what are we doing to incentivize them to come out and lawyer up? And a lot of times it's the juice isn't worth the squeeze, when you're talking about $250,000. When you look at what happened in this situation with Fox Varian, they're paying for past and future suffering, but also future medical expenses. And I think the $400,000 is short there. But this will cause a tidal wave across states and increasing, the damages that can be claimed by these folks that were harmed, but also increasing the statutes of limitations. Remember, most of these kids are going to be in their mid-20s before they finally wake up and realize how damaged they were and how harmed they were. And so 2-year statute of limitations on this stuff is just not going to cut it. And so we're pushing for 10 and 20 years.
Yeah. And part of her testimony, I believe, also was that she endures nerve pain now, like chronic nerve pain that she is not going to be able to get rid of. And it goes back to the physical harm piece that just wasn't communicated because nobody knew. Nobody knew because of how experimental these procedures were. And now, geez.
Stay tuned. You might hear some work in this area here in the state of Ohio here pretty soon.
Yeah. And it was interesting, too, that in light of this story, then the American Society of Plastic Surgeons came out, one of the first major medical groups in America came out and said, yeah, that's probably not best practice. Now, they stopped short of saying that this should actually become law or anything like that. But still, to have an organization coming out and saying, best practice would be not to do this on children is a step in the right direction, too.
Yeah, this will, again, that chain reaction of, that's one association, but there's going to be more medical associations covering their tail. They can't afford to look away anymore, but also the insurance companies are going to be weighing in on this as well.
Because they're all about risk. And if they see that risk going up, it's not going to be worth it for them to cover these types of procedures. Also want to share some exciting news here around CCV, just because it's something I know you worked closely on, David, with the OAHC, the Ohio Adolescent Health Centers, and the work that they do, the vital work that they do in our public school systems in Ohio. And just kind of a neat story that's come together after they were given funding in the state budget, and then just because of a variety of things that happened, it looked like it was going to fall through for them, but got some exciting news this week that the funding was delivered, and they've got hopefully all the funding they need to do some really important work specific to our Hope in the Future initiative, too.
That's right. Yeah, OAHC, or Ohio Adolescent Health Centers, are just a phenomenal group. It is our largest prevention program in the state of Ohio, going into the public schools, talking about character education, sexual risk avoidance, fatherhood, the success sequence. So all of the bills you hear us talking about that we're trying to get mandated to be instructed, including instruction across the state, success sequence, baby Olivia, the fetal development work, the $20 million of fatherhood money that's out there that we're trying to get into kids. If we want message integrity, it's got to go through groups like the Ohio Adolescent Health Centers, and they just do a phenomenal job. I used to be a part of them years ago, before the Lord called me here to Nineveh. I would say that the how the sausage is made in this story here. I mean, you pass a bill, right? We're trying to get funding to this group of 9 programs. We get it through the House, we get it through the Senate. The governor signs it, $15.6 million over a course of 2 years, the biennium. The bureaucracy that it was put into, the State Department that was put into, had issues with that, and funds were not released. And I'll just leave it at that. All right. So we passed another bill, and the budget correction bill, right? Okay. Well, if there were mistakes made on the House side, what needs to be fixed? So they made the fixes in the language, goes through the House, goes through the Senate, governor signs it again. Let's get these people this money so they can reach these young people in the schools. That department still had issues with the language that they gave us, right, to fix the problem.
Hold on. The language that they gave. Just need to highlight that real quick.
Right. And, it gets all the way to the point where, we're making daily calls to the Senate. Thank you so much, Rep. Lear. Thank you so much, Senator Brenner, for leaning in on this and helping in this area. Governor's office was phenomenal on this. But it got to the point where, they said, well, you know what? It's kind of like when Moses was talking to Pharaoh about let my people go. And it was all these concessions that was trying to be made here. Well, we found $1 million over the course of the biennium, and I think we can get that over there to them. Like, no, there was legislation passed, right? Mm-hmm. Signed by the governor twice. We need $15.6 million. And about 3 weeks later, somehow they found the other $14.6 million. So that money has been received, and they are ramping up to meet the needs of these kids across the state.
Yeah, and it's such an encouraging story too, just because it's not an overly large organization. Like they really need to maximize their budget, and they were kind of feeling the pinch, right? Like,
and they still are. I mean, even though they got the funding, okay, the timeline for implementation has been drastically shortened. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they are, frantically getting out there doing the work. But they do have schools that are just waiting, for them to be able to answer the call to come in and do this programming right there on the public school grounds. And
it's probably getting into the weeds a little bit too, but the reason that this is so vital is that really the only other alternative schools have to what OAHC is offering is the comprehensive sex education curriculum from Planned Parenthood.
Right. Well, the way they used to say it was safe sex versus abstinence, right? Or but now it's sexual risk avoidance versus sexual risk reduction. And if we say that we don't want Planned Parenthood in there indoctrinating kids and the gender unicorn or the genderbread person or man, they change this stuff over and over again. It's crazy.
Isn't that your nickname?
Okay, here we go. See, I'm pressing charges this time. All right, I want him written up. HR
heading straight down to the HR office as soon as we're done recording.
Life abhors a vacuum, Mike, and so we can't just curse the darkness and not support the solution, and that's what OAHC does.
Yeah, it's a great story. We'll have more on it over the course of the next few weeks here at CCV, and hopefully really be able to capture the story and how much God was behind it. Yeah, throughout every step of the way is, I think, the big takeaway for all of us. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get back and have that conversation with Danny Funt for you. Again, it's going to be an important one. Start planning now to share it with people. Talk about it at the Super Bowl party with your friends about why they need to understand the sports gambling industry better, and this is the resource that they can get for an introduction to everything that's going on.
I'm betting that this is going to be a great interview, Mike.
Oh, man. He just had to go there. On that note, we will be back with the Danny Funt interview coming up on The Narrative.
If you've got something to say, we want to help you say it. I'm Vince Tornero. Since 2018, Wessler Media has helped churches, organizations, and events amplify their message through podcast, video, and social media. We also happen to produce The Narrative too. Let's talk. WesslerMedia.com. WESSLER Media.com.
My name is Lauren Metters, and I'm the Business Development Manager for the Christian Business Partnership. I want to invite you to imagine something with me for just a moment. Imagine if every Christian business owner in Ohio tossed a single rock in the same pond. One person tossing one rock makes a ripple in the pond, but thousands hitting the water at the same moment can make a big wave, big enough to change the entire structure of that pond. This is what happens when we join forces. Suddenly, we aren't just protecting Christian values in the marketplace. We're shaping the future of our communities, our economy, and the next generation. When Christian business owners stand together, we create real impact. That is why the Christian Business Partnership exists. Our members gain access to affordable group rate health insurance, discounted workers' comp, and other programs that protect your bottom line, all while amplifying your voice at the State House and standing strong for pro-family and pro-business legislation. Join our community where hundreds of Christian employers grow stronger together every year. Visit cbpohio.org today and become part of the movement.
And we're back on The Narrative. Mike Andrews, David Mahan, joined now by Danny Funt, who covers sports betting as a contributor at the Washington Post. His reporting has also appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He previously worked as an editor at The Week magazine. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and Columbia Journalism School, and he lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with his wife and son. And we're excited to talk with him today about a new book that he has out. It's called Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. Danny, it's so good to have you here on The Narrative. Thanks for the time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I gotta ask about the title of the book, because all the sports betting advertisements that I have seen make it seem everybody's winning. Everybody's winning. Just play and you're guaranteed to win. So talk to me about just the title and overall theme of the book, Everybody Loses, when it comes to the sports betting industry here in America.
Yeah, that title was the culmination of talking to hundreds of people, not just bettors of all types, but policymakers, researchers, scholars, lawmakers. So many people have a stake in this story. And what I found was not only is it borderline impossible to actually win money, maybe 1% of customers come out ahead, despite how advertising, as you were touching on, is so to the contrary, and we can get into that. But losing on a level beyond finances, the losses that people suffer when a family member develops a gambling addiction is devastating, potentially. Losing the credibility of sports as people question the integrity of games now that there's so many match fixing scandals. Losing the independence of sports media, since so many of those companies have partnerships with gambling operators that might make them reluctant to cover the full story of the good and bad of legalization. It's losing on a broad and fairly overwhelming level. And I hope people grapple with that and ask, are we comfortable with that? And also, who's winning? Because that's sometimes an even harder question to answer.
Right. I think, your immediate thought of everybody's losing is you're thinking about the ones that are placing the bets, right? But, from my understanding of your work and just the little bit of dabbling I've been doing here in public policy, I mean, who are the players, right? Like, who are the sports books winning, or is state government winning? I mean, so who are the major players here when we're talking about gambling expansion?
Even that is not as big a group as you might expect. Something like 60 companies flooded the marketplace when legalization took off after a Supreme Court decision in 2018. And certain states licensed a handful of operators. Some, like Colorado, where I used to live, licensed close to 30. The presumption was that the house always wins. Gambling is one of the most bankable businesses, and this would not just be good for those companies, generate a lot of jobs, be an interesting new industry. In fact, basically two companies dominate, FanDuel and DraftKings. It seems like we're headed toward a duopoly where they control the entirety of the market. And a lot of those other companies are fighting for survival, pulling out of states, being acquired, or just going out of business because it's harder than people realized, even people in the industry, to make money from sports betting. As for states, that was one of the main arguments was this is going to bring in a huge influx of tax revenue. Mm-hmm. In some states, it's been pretty considerable. In others, it's fallen far short of expectations. And when you think about the entirety of budgetary needs in a state, sometimes the money they're actually making off sports betting is a pittance. It doesn't really move the needle. But even beyond that, and this is so important, this isn't just money you find like in the cushions of your couch, right? This is money that people are losing, your constituents are losing. There's sometimes ripple effects in their personal finances, in economics, if they're spending money on gambling and not on another business or, even investing in other forms. So there was one person in the state attorney general's office in Massachusetts who I thought summed this up. He said, people just aren't realizing that the costs of legalization to public health and to so many other things will so outweigh whatever's generated from tax revenue that it's just, and that argument is going to fall apart. And I think we're already seeing that.
I'm like, 35 now, Mike? And when I was
35 years ago,
I don't remember a time where this has been such a large issue. Where did it come from? Like, why is this dominating conversation now? Why are state, capitals all across the country dealing with regulation in this area when maybe 5-10 years ago, this wasn't such a big deal?
Yeah, so the story, as it's often told, starts with New Jersey. Governor Chris Christie at the time, who developed, a national profile, he saw the state's casinos, mainly in Atlantic City, going out of business. Racetracks were suffering, and he said, why is it fair that Nevada has this sports betting business that draws people to their casinos and New Jersey is deprived of that like every other state because of a 1992 federal law against bookmaking outside of Nevada? So he fought in federal court. All of the professional sports leagues and the NCAA opposed that effort. And finally, the Supreme Court in 2018 ruled that this federal law was invalid and that states were free to legalize. Critically, they were very clear that Congress did have the authority to restrict bookmaking. They could even potentially grandfather Nevada, but say the 49 other states can't do this. It was just that that law had gone about it in a strange way that was unconstitutional, as the court found. But despite the caveat that Congress could just write a new law and restrict states from legalizing this, there wasn't the political will in Congress, and so many states facing a lot of pressure from not just the sports books, but from the sports leagues, which had been converted to become proponents of legalization, raced to legalize. I'll just quickly add that I mentioned that's sort of the conventional way of telling the story. A curious detail that I cover in my book is that, in fact, the legalization effort was initiated by these offshore sports betting operators. For a long time, basically since there's been an internet, Americans have been placing bets through companies based in Panama and Curacao and other parts of Latin America that take bets illegally, even though they're operated overseas, but they're taking bets from Americans. And those companies actually funded the initial steps of the legalization effort because they wanted to legitimize their businesses and be able to do business, above board in the U.S. So that's a funny wrinkle, because the argument was, let's drive out these black market operators, let's put them out of business. In fact, to a large extent, it was the black market operators who were leading the charge initially for legalization.
I want to go back to what you said about the sports leagues that initially opposed this expansion legalization of sports gambling, and how they so quickly pivoted to become champions and endorsers of it. Because I even remember, I'm a big Cleveland Guardians fan. I talk about it fairly often as I can tie it into the work we do here. I'll bring it up on the podcast. And I remember there was there's like a fan shop in Progressive Field where the Guardians play, and was one of my favorite little kind of off the beaten path places to go during a game. And the next year it was a sports book, like just closed overnight and became a sports book. So we went from teams and leagues opposing this to now hosting sports books on site in stadiums. Has your reporting shown like what the impetus was for that change?
Definitely. And by the way, it would be one thing if legalization were happening and they said, gee, we're not going to be able to fight this, so it goes. But the fact, as you were illustrating, is their embrace could not be more enthusiastic, and they could not have integrated the business of sports and the fan experience with gambling more profoundly. This is not ancient history that the leagues were so adamant that gambling was an existential threat that they definitely did not want to see expanded beyond Nevada. As of barely a decade ago, the commissioner of baseball was saying gambling was an evil that threatened to destroy his sport and other sports if it were brought into the mainstream across the country. And I'll get to what changed their minds, but I did just want to stop and note that one thing I found so interesting about how things have changed, and I think your audience might take interest in, is just this moral language that used to be used to describe gambling, calling it an evil, saying that it would result in a moral erosion among fans and players if people started viewing the game through a gambling lens. A lot of other stuff like that that spoke in a language of vice and virtue. That's disappeared in a lot of areas of public life beyond sports. And I think that's a big part of why the resistance to gambling in so many places has disappeared. And we can get into that. But what I found was that in 2014, the commissioner of basketball, Adam Silver, published a newspaper op-ed coming out in favor of legalization. This came as a huge surprise to the other leagues because they had joined the NBA in federal court in fighting that effort in New Jersey to overturn the federal ban on bookmaking. But what the Commissioner Silver saw was that in Europe, gambling had been a huge way that British soccer in particular had become a global sport and attracted this global audience. The NBA very clearly wants to grow its international fan base, and they saw gambling as a way of achieving that. As the case was being fought in federal court after that op-ed was published, representatives from the gambling industry were meeting with the leagues secretively, sometimes so secretively that they did it in cafes rather than at the league offices because they just didn't want to be seen welcoming gambling reps in their building. But in those meetings, the industry showed them studies that they had commissioned that showed gamblers are rabid consumers of sports because they've got money on the line. They'll watch games that traditional fans don't care about. Maybe more importantly, they'll watch to the ends of blowouts because they want to see how a bet resolves, even if the game has long since been decided and normal fans have moved on with their day. And as the league saw their TV audience dwindling, with young people not wanting to sit through a 3 or 4 hour game and people of all ages canceling their cable subscriptions, that posed a real threat to TV rights, which are the biggest moneymaker for the leagues, not ticket sales or merchandise. The rights to show pro and college games is the cash cow of sports. And when they saw that evidence that this would make their audience potentially hyper engaged, just make, a compulsive audience thanks to the opportunity to gamble, that was hugely attractive to the leagues. And as soon as the Supreme Court gave them cover to flip-flop and say, well, we opposed it, but the court has ruled, what can we do? They became such aggressive champions for legalization and were instrumental in lobbying so many states to not just get on board, but to do it so quickly and to pass legislation that had basically been drafted by the betting industry, if you can believe that. The leagues and the operators, even back then, were working totally in lockstep to fulfill the gambling industry's wish list.
Yeah, this is very, very helpful. I don't know if we've ever delved this deep into just the industry side. And our listeners, they hear me say that, actually, I just talked to a group of pastors the other day, and you kind of nod and go to sleep if you think about, oh, well, yeah, some people are going to smoke, Dave, get over it. Some people are going to gamble, Dave, get over it. They're just thinking about one-offs. We're dealing with addiction-for-profit industries that are targeting, entire state and most vulnerable, especially children. And I do want to get into that side of things. Yes, there's the side where you're just destroying sports, right? Like this is just, prop bets and things like that. But there is the danger to humans and how it's affected. So I want to get into that piece, especially how young people are getting into this, because, right, kids aren't supposed to be able to jump on sports books and place bets anyway, right? But yet so much of this conversation centers around kids. How is it affecting young people and how are they getting involved?
This is one of the biggest examples, and there are a few prominent ones that I highlight in the book, but the argument from the leagues and certain politicians that there was a lot of betting happening through the black market and all they've done is bring it above board so it can be taxed and regulated does not hold water. It's very clear that way more people are betting on sports than ever were who had to, find a neighborhood bookie or bet through some sketchy website. And the fact that so many kids are suddenly consumed with gambling is a clear example of that. When I was in college in the mid-2010s, I was a big sports fan. I was hanging out with a lot of fellow sports fans. No one was talking about betting. I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you could find someone who would take a bet. It just was not how people engaged with sports. Fast forward just several years, I highlight a person in the book who went to my alma mater. It was all people were doing, and he developed just a devastating gambling addiction while he was in college that ruined his college experience, caused him to accumulate debts that he's still working to pay off. It's heartbreaking, honestly, and it's something that this problem did not exist at nearly this level. I live in North Carolina. Half of the calls to our problem gambling hotline now come from parents who are concerned about what they're seeing in their kids who are suddenly desperate to find ways to bet. I've even heard of kids as young as elementary school who are developing gambling problems, if you can believe that. It's not so hard now to find an older sibling or, a friend, classmate, whatever, who will place your bets if you're underage. Even parents, as strange as this might sound, I've heard stories where they're facilitating their kids betting because they think there's a lot worse that they could be doing than, betting on sports. I see everyone else betting. What's the big deal? And I think as the learning curve comes around and people realize it's actually a really dangerous thing for a minor to get caught up in for not just their education, but their mental well-being and developing other dependencies that often coincide with a gambling problem. The fact that so many kids are betting, I think, is what's really cause a lot of people I talk to be panicking and could definitely move the needle as lawmakers think this is out of hand.
Yeah, I think we saw there was in the Lancet, I think maybe last year or the year before, showed that nearly 1 in 5 teenagers gambled in the last year. That blew me away.
And 1 in 5 college students dip into money set aside for tuition to gamble on sports. So it's not a fringe issue.
I'm by no means familiar with sports betting at large, especially with the two that you mentioned, DraftKings and FanDuel. But just from the way that they advertise, it sure looks like the apps are very gamified, like kind of make it very easy to get sucked in and pulled in and just keep betting and betting and betting. Certainly that's a feature of their model and not a bug. Is that correct?
No question. Earlier you mentioned that it sort of depends on it's addiction for profit, and that's a pretty provocative way of putting it, but there's definitely specific efforts to get people to be betting compulsively at a rate that almost no one would argue is healthy or sustainable. An example of that is, not too long ago, most bets were on who would win or lose. So you might be betting before the game, and then you sit back and worry about if your bet's going to succeed or fail. Now, a huge piece of this business is bets placed during games. And if you think about it, being able to bet on your phone enables that in a way that betting over the phone or in person in Nevada just didn't allow. And they want you to be betting constantly during the course of the game. I spoke with an executive at a company that generates those sorts of micro bets, as they're called. And I said, betting every few minutes as opposed to every few hours really sounds like a road to compulsive behavior. And he jumped in and he said, sticky. Sticky is the euphemism for getting you, glued to your phone and glued to betting throughout a game. The other thing I said was, I could imagine a lot of customers who might bet, let's say, $10 before a game would now bet $10 10 times if they're betting constantly over the course of the game. And he said, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we're after. So it's just a path toward overdoing it. And I spoke with a psychologist at the University of New Mexico who studied the mentalities of online sports bettors. He got a significant grant to do a fairly groundbreaking study along those lines. And he was just saying, to him, this business is finding ways to make it as frictionless as possible. Another kind of marketing piece of jargon, make it as seamless as you can to be betting constantly. He thinks there should be friction points. You want to slow people down so they think, am I getting carried away, or am I just in this trance of betting constantly and I look up and I'm overdone it? And when you hear a third of sports bettors say they've felt ashamed in hindsight at how much money they've lost, I think the argument for those friction points is pretty compelling.
What is the gateway drug for gambling? How is it? Because if it is an addiction for profit industry, you make money not by addicting 65-year-olds, right? You make money by getting younger addicts. So how do they develop and generate young addicts for their addiction for profit industry?
I always feel silly quoting anything that's remotely neuroscientific just because it's so not my expertise. But smarter people who are experts and, doctors or researchers explain that just before you're in your mid-20s, the prefrontal lobe of your brain isn't fully developed. So your ability to regulate risk-seeking and, seeking that kind of adrenaline rush that gambling can generate,
right.
Risk assessment, all that stuff, you're not fully equipped to navigate that safely. So, I mentioned mid-20s, you could be of age, above 21 in most states, above 18 in some states, and legally be doing this. And you're just not built to do it safely. Beyond that, I think that, it feels so basic, but the way that superstar athletes, people in media who we love reading their columns or listening to their podcasts or whatever, who have helped normalize gambling because they're being paid so much from the industry, that definitely has an impact on young people. And for a long time, I was wary of comparing it to the tobacco industry just because that's such a provocative comparison. But an expert who did litigation to go after tobacco companies, who's now focused on sports betting, he pointed out that you can't deny that what was happening in the 50s and 60s with celebrities smoking in commercials and, billboards and whatever, and making it seem like harmless fun for kids is definitely reminiscent of the way that our biggest sports heroes are now in these nonstop commercials saying, I'm betting, you should be too. And yeah, I think if you're a kid, who could resist? The last thing I'll say on that is I spoke with a expert who's at the University of Toronto named Jeffrey Derevensky, and he studies youth problem gambling. I think he's done a study of high schoolers in Ohio as it happens. But he was explaining that so often, if you develop a gambling problem, you'll find yourself betting on everything you can find, right? The lottery, casinos, sports, you name it. But sports for young people is often the starting point because they already love sports. They're seeing so many people suggest it's harmless. And as you were saying, that can be a gateway. It's even quite clearly the business model for this industry is to use it as a gateway. A lot of these sports betting operators, where it's legal, also have online casinos. And their hope is you sign up because you love sports. And then eventually they say, hey, it's a commercial in the game you're watching or you're waiting for a bet to resolve. Why don't you play some blackjack or roulette or poker or whatever while you're waiting? And that, as profitable as sports betting can be, online casino gambling is just a whole different universe and a whole different level of danger for its addictiveness. So yes, this is definitely could be argued to be a gateway, as you put it.
I mean, Mike, I'm on Facebook the other day. I'm looking at a nice pair of tennis shoes, pops up on the screen, right? And so I click on the thing. It was a Temu ad. Is that how you?
Were they orthopedic in
Absolutely,
function?
absolutely. 12-inch soles, gun bottoms. But the thing was, there was a Temu ad that pops up, and it was a roulette wheel. And I'm thinking, how much of this is going on in kids' video games and and kids' ads and things like that, where you get to play these casino games that lead on and loot boxes in video games, right? I'm telling parents about loot boxes and all that. And it kind of addicts kids and get them drawn into this whole gambling stuff. And then, they get a bookie at school and then it's over.
Can I just jump in and say to your point about shopping and seeing, gambling on the screen somehow? Ohio has been exceptional, whether it's Governor DeWine or your casino regulator, in restricting certain forms of, inappropriate marketing. One category was these risk-free promotions that definitely have risk involved and were a big part of how Americans all over the country were seduced into signing up for accounts. In Ohio, when y'all legalized, they said, we're not going to allow that. That's totally deceptive. The other category was there's this company called Fanatics that's main business or a big piece of their business is sports merchandise, jerseys and what have you.
Big
And when
distribution house here in Ohio.
Yeah. And when they launched a sports book, their thought was, we've got all these people who are buying sports merch. Let's advertise betting whenever they're making a purchase, or we have their email and we'll go after them that way. And my understanding is that Ohio stepped in and said that's not okay either. That, you can't go out, you can't, profile people because they're showing a shopping interest in sports and then try to get them to become gamblers. So credit, I guess, to your state. It's definitely not the norm across the country.
I want to touch a little bit on the media piece that you've brought up a couple of different times, because this is one of my hobby horse arguments is the fall of Sports Center. How that used to be such a great way to start the day. And back in my school years on sick days, watching Sports Center all day was a highlight. Now it's, nothing but betting lines and prop bets and all that kind of stuff. So can you talk a little bit about how the media got involved, how the media became such big champions of these platforms, and I would say ruined how we consume sports in general?
Yeah, but first I'll just say, early when I was covering this, someone asked me, could you ever imagine a world where a parent wouldn't want their kids watching sports because they wouldn't want them bombarded with gambling ads? And at the time I was like, that's too far. I don't see that. That feels extreme. And now it feels a lot more possible. I mentioned that certain leagues, when they were meeting representatives of the gambling industry, held those meetings at cafes because they were so reluctant to, you know, welcome those companies in their doors. Disney did the very same. Disney, of course, owns ABC and ESPN. And at the time, like, they wanted nothing to do with gambling. They definitely wouldn't mention betting odds during a broadcast or invoke it when analyzing a game. That was totally forbidden at Disney properties and across sports media for years. They too, a big piece of this as to why sports media jumped in is sadly a lot of media outlets are fighting for survival and they're laying people off or they're shutting down a print newspaper and going online only. Across the board, it's really hard times for sports media and media in general. So if in the past they could stand on principle and say, we're not going to take those advertising dollars and in turn promote gambling so aggressively, a lot of them just said we couldn't resist a revenue stream when we're fighting for our lives. So ESPN in particular is just so on the nose and so overboard. They launched their own sports book that failed, but they're now one of DraftKings' biggest clients, and DraftKings ads are just plastered all over anytime you're watching an ESPN show. And I'm worried about that not only because it just normalizes betting, but also because I'd like to think that sports journalists would cover the dangers of gambling and the harms that it's doing. And from people I talk to in that industry, they say, we feel like our hands are tied because we're getting so much money from these gambling sponsors and they're helping us stay afloat. It's scary and intimidating to do something that would embarrass them or embarrass the leagues for doing business with them. As a former ESPN reporter put it, it's kind of like sports media is being bribed to not say anything that would be bad for the gambling business. So as a journalist, that really pains me because I think we have such a responsibility to cover everything to do with sports, including gambling now, without pulling punches. And that's just not the case at a lot of outlets.
Well, Danny, you've been so gracious with your time. And as we start to wrap up here, the question I find on my mind is, do you think we're close to any kind of public reckoning on this subject, or what is it going to take to get there where public outcry is so loud that we actually do have to reckon with what sports gambling has become in America?
I think there's some momentum among lawmakers. Last year, after those Guardians pitchers were accused of fixing games, Governor DeWine said prop betting, this betting on statistical outcomes and like games within the game, was a failed experiment, as he put it, that should be banned. Other people are echoing that. There's also pressure to restrict advertising, particularly advertising that exposes kids unnecessarily. I'll leave you with a very chilling prediction from that same researcher who was studying the mentalities of sports bettors. I give his opinion a lot of weight, seems to be a very insightful man. He said he could see 3 things that would really cause people to wake up to how out of hand things are. The first was a major match-fixing scandal, even bigger than what we've seen, where a superstar or a really high-profile game is found to be fixed, and people say, this is destroying sports, we're not going to stand for that. The other was a rash of suicides among gambling addicts, which has happened elsewhere in the world and motivated a crackdown, and sadly, that seems like it's on the table here as gambling addiction rates surge. And lastly, there's such a influx of harassment and violent threats toward athletes from enraged gamblers whenever a player costs them a bet. And he said if there was ever actually an attempted murder of an athlete because they had cost someone money, that would be a bridge too far for a lot of people and say we must rein this in. As he put it, he's rooting for the match-fixing scandal because that doesn't involve people dying, but it's a pretty grim outlook, and I don't think it's alarmist. I think that those tragedies are in play based on just how rapidly gambling is growing across the country.
Danny, when we reached out to see if we could get you on as a guest, I told you We've been looking for somebody to talk to about this issue that had kind of done the deep dive on the topic, and finding your book and having this conversation. I don't want to speak for David, but so grateful for the work that you've put into this. If you could you tell our audience where they can get the book or where they can follow your work for more updates as you keep on top of sports betting?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. The book is Everybody Loses, The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. I'm Danny Funt. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, hopefully your local bookstore. Wherever they sell books, I'm crossing my fingers you can find Everybody Loses. So thank you both very much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.